afternoon or early evening. Welcome to our CAHSS faculty and community event. I'm really happy to be doing this and really pleased to see you here this afternoon. One of the things that we're trying to do in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences is remember to introduce myself, which is what my staff just told me. My name's Danny McIntosh. I'm Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and this is our faculty and community event. One thing we're trying to do in the college is to demonstrate the mix of expertise, the different perspectives we have in the wide variety of faculty and courses and departments that we have in the college. We have 13 departments and 2 schools that range across the creative and the liberal arts. We teach not only undergraduate, but graduate students, and we outreach to the community. And that last part is what the focus of tonight's session is. The University of Denver's motto is that we're a private university dedicated to the public good. We do that in a variety of ways. One of the primary ways we do that is through our educational mission, and that is teaching students, graduate and undergraduate students, community members about the work that we do, about looking at the world in new ways, about thinking new thoughts, and about talking with individuals who differ from us in their perspectives, and learning new perspectives and ways of solving problems. Another way that we act for the public good is by working with the community of Denver and the global community in the research that we do, in the art that we create, in our engagement with the community in improving our own learning, our own experiences, and working to make contributions to the wider community. Tonight we have 4 faculty members from 4 different departments and schools who will be sharing in what are called lightning talks, so I'm expecting lots of fireworks. Lightning talks about the work that they're doing. And these are intentionally faculty from a diverse number of areas so that all of you can see the variety of things that we're doing. As you think of questions, try to remember them while also listening to the other speakers, because we'll have some time at the end to ask questions of all of the speakers once they've all had a chance to talk. The presenters this year are Elizabeth Escobedo, Roger Holland, Roddy Mcginnis, and Killian Kim. So I'm going to introduce them, but I'm going to let you know that each have 15 minutes. You can ask questions at the very end, and that they're really very nice people. Our first presenter is Elizabeth Escobedo. She's an associate professor of Latinx history with a specialization in 20th century Mexican-American history. Her book, From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, The Lives of Mexican-American Women on the World War II Homefront, received the Coalition for Western Women's History, our Jameson Book Prize, and the Best History Book in English from the International Latino Book Awards. Our second presenter is Roger Holland, a teaching assistant professor in music and religion at the director of the Spirituals Project in the Lamont School of Music. He's a graduate of Union Theological Seminary in New York. He also served as artist in residence and director of the Union Gospel Choir for over 13 years. In 2015, Union awarded him the Trailblazers Distinguished Alumni Award for his contributions to the legacy of African American music. Our third presenter is Roddy Mcginnis, who's been teaching photography at the University of Denver since 2001. He also was a professor for the photographer who took my children's senior pictures, so his work hangs on my wall. She was very impressed that I did it. McGinnis considers himself to be an autobiographical photographer, and in that capacity has been documenting his life through photography for over 5 decades, which I guess says something about your life. Yeah. He received an MFA in photography from the University of Colorado Boulder and a BA in photography from Edinburgh Napier University in Edinburgh, Scotland. He is a beloved instructor, and I think he'll be talking about his community work with around the community. Now Killian is worried. Our fourth presenter is Killian Kim, the director of the Family and Child Neuroscience Laboratory and associate professor in psychology here at DU. She completed her master's at Harvard University and PhD in developmental psychology at Cornell and postdoctoral training at the National Institute of Mental Health. Her research program focuses on the relationships between experience, brain, and emotional development. Please join me in welcoming our presenters.
everyone, and thank you, Dean McIntosh, for your generous introductions. I will say that it is quite an honor to be here this evening to share the stage tonight with my esteemed colleagues who are widely sharing their talents and who are giving so much to our larger community. It is also quite an honor to share with you all the experiences I've had working with fellow faculty and students here at DU on what we now call the CAHSS, Casa De Paz learning community. As I say, in all honesty, this has been one of the most rewarding opportunities I've had in my career here at DU. This journey began when I started thinking about ways in which to offer community learning experiences to my students within the context of a history class, a discipline that largely looks at the past. I offer a 20th century US immigration course for the history department, and it's a class that allows my students to look at the experiences of a variety of different immigrant groups. We study Asian populations, Europeans, members of the Latinx population, among others. And together we explore the ways in which immigration holds really a pretty peculiar place in our national narrative. At the same time that the United States celebrates its identity as a self-proclaimed nation of immigrants, immigration policy and the presence of diverse communities and peoples from around the world have historically generated very intense battles over identity and national security and civic belonging. So together, as a class, we look at the ways in which race and ethnicity, gender, class, among other things, have determined how Americans conceive of immigrants and of our nation at large. As a historian, I always work really hard to get the voices of peoples we're studying into the classroom. This can be really challenging, though, especially when you're teaching about historically underrepresented and disadvantaged groups like immigrant populations. And so I go out of my way then to expose my students to primary sources. Sources produced during the time being studied by the people being studied, such as oral histories and music and poetry and art, ethnic newspapers. All of these sources give us a window and allows us to best capture the perspectives of the most vulnerable and least represented. And so in so doing, I began to think more and more about getting students in contact with today's immigrant populations, especially because so much of today's immigration trends and policies can be explained by historical antecedents. So when I began this journey of rethinking my immigration history course, I recently read a story about a young woman by the name of Sarah Jackson, pictured here, who is now the executive director of Casa De Paz, who opened her one-bedroom apartment, purposely rented near the Geo Immigration Detention Center in Aurora, to immigrants recently released. She shared her modest home so that those who left the detention center without money or support could have access to a phone and a bed. She often gave up her bed and slept on the couch to support migrants, and a meal as they started their journey to reunite with family members. So I reached out to Sarah, who I soon found out is always really enthusiastic for volunteer support, and our community partnership began. I decided that before I asked students to volunteer with CAHSS, I should probably do so myself, in order to see what my students would be experiencing and what they might expect from their experience. By the time I first visited Casa De Paz, Sarah had moved the organization into a larger rented house, which you can see here, had more space, so she no longer had to give up her bed or turn people away on a regular basis. Then, like today, Casa De Paz is 100% volunteer run and provides those recently released from detention shelter and meals, access to a phone, Wi-Fi service, and computers, in addition to transportation and accompaniment to the local bus station and or airport. Since they first opened their doors, they've hosted over 2,800 immigrants from 73 different countries. The one evening of volunteering where I first started this journey was quite eye-opening. I served as a host to a young Mexican-American dreamer, an undocumented man who had crossed the border with his parents when he was 2 years old. And he had lived in the United States ever since. He was now in his early 20s. And on one recent fateful evening, Miguel was approached by authorities on the streets of Salt Lake City, Utah, and asked for proof of his citizenship. When he couldn't provide it, and he told authorities he was indeed undocumented, he was promptly taken into immigration custody. His cell phone was taken away from him, and he had no way to notify his friends and family as to where he was. Days later, Miguel was transferred to the for-profit Geo-Detention Center in Aurora, Colorado, again with no opportunity to alert his friends and family. In detention, he was regularly fed spoiled food. He was paid $1 per day for his 8-hour shifts in working in the kitchen. He had inadequate medical care, no access to fresh air or the outdoors, and he still was not able to contact his loved ones. He shared with me that it wasn't until he got the ear of a pastor visiting detainees that he was able to ask the clergyman to please locate his Facebook page and profile and write on his wall, letting his family and friends know where he was. When you volunteer at the CAHSS, you quickly learn that Miguel's story is not an anomaly. The individuals in this facility are mostly being held in civil custody. These are not criminal offenses. About 85% of those held are immigrants seeking asylum after fleeing persecution and torture in their home countries. They can await, they can await release anywhere from days to weeks to years, depending on when a judge hears their case. When migrants are finally released from detention, they do so without money. Most are never given cell phones if they had one on them when they were picked up. And they are released only with the clothes they came in with. So if you are picked up in the summer months in a tank top and shorts, you can easily be released in the middle of Denver winter with the same attire. I was eager for my students to support and learn from individuals like Miguel. In fall of 2017, my service learning history class, Immigration in 20th Century America, worked closely with Casa De Paz as a community partner. Students enrolled in the class visited migrants in detention. They served as hosts at the casa, where they provided migrants access to a home-cooked meal and supported conversation. They assisted migrants in their travel plans to reunite with family. And so over the course of the quarter, these students learned 20th century US immigration history in the classroom while gaining firsthand, first-person insight into the plight of undocumented immigrants and their lives outside of the classroom. At the end of the quarter, we invited Sarah Jackson, again the executive director, to a teach-in event where students shared their experiences volunteering with the CAHSS and the connections they've made to class materials. In the audience, which if anyone knows Sarah, this is quite common, she got really teary hearing about what the time at the CAHSS had meant to our students, because it was quite a meaningful experience for most of them. At the end of the presentations, I excitedly announced to the entire crowd that the course had recently been approved by the history department for regular rotation, which would mean that I'd be able to offer it once a year. Okay, I'm thrilled. I can't wait to tell Sarah this great news, but I will never forget Sarah's first response. She looked at me sadly and said, "So I'll have to wait a whole nother year to work with DU students again?" And I was crestfallen. And it was at that moment that I realized she's right. This experience is too important to sequester to just 1 year. And it was there and then that the idea of the Casa De Paz learning community was born. CAHSS Associate Dean Ingrid Tay provided many ideas and support for such a learning community, and I thereafter reached out to many immigration experts that we have teaching on our campus. And soon we had an entire cohort, shown here, ready and willing to work with the CAHSS. So the Casa De Paz learning community now includes a cluster of courses by a group of professors from different disciplines within the college. And I am so happy to have on the team Professor Lisa Martinez in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, Alejandro Cerrón, Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology, Sergio Macias, Teaching Associate Professor in the Department of Languages and Literatures, and Lina Parado, Teaching Assistant and Director of Spanish for Heritage Speakers program. What is really exciting about this opportunity is that these professors have guided students through courses connected with the learning community, and each year we engage about 80 undergrads in the community in nearly 1,000 hours of volunteer service with the CAHSS. Involved students thus not only have the opportunity to learn about immigration from history, but from other disciplines like anthropology and languages and literatures and sociology. Most importantly, with generous support from the Madden Center and the Mellon Foundation and the Center for Community Engagement to Advance Scholarship and Learning, the experiential learning component provided more students with opportunities to connect with immigrants. As the cohort has grown, we've included opportunities for students on campus to attend events to raise awareness about immigration, detention, and deportation, even after individual courses are completed. One such event took place in May of 2019, and we called it the Casa De Paz Cookin. This was designed by Professor Lisa Martinez as an event to bring campus and communities get together to cook and eat and share. Members in attendance cooked meals inspired by the home countries of the people they met as part of their service learning classes at the CAHSS. Once the cooking was complete, teams shared stories of the person and country that inspired their dish, which were then served for guests in attendance. It was a night of community building and reflection and really good food. I won't lie, there are difficulties that come with teaching community-based courses with really vulnerable populations. We ask a lot of our students who are involved. They are asked to listen and hear about the often very difficult and traumatic experiences that immigrants and their families face. It can be a very emotionally taxing experience. And for some of our students from historically underrepresented communities, it can hit all too close to home. This being said, amidst these difficulties, there comes a tremendous opportunity to learn and practice human connection and empathy. The effort encourages students to think critically about popular misconceptions and stereotypes about immigrants, focusing attention on the human side of immigration policy decisions and debates in ways that a textbook and a news soundbite simply can't. The experience also affords many students the opportunity to engage with communities that are really simply very different from their own, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of community members. For those students taking the Spanish service learning courses, for instance, students reported having felt, quote, empowered by the fact that they were able to utilize Spanish in real life settings and meaningful life-changing experiences. Along similar lines, other students note how much they had in common with the person that they visited at the Geo-Detention Center in terms of age, taste in music, favorite pastimes, something they never could have imagined happening prior to volunteering with the CAHSS. So above and beyond course readings and assignments, these types of interactions speak to the importance of experiential learning education. It's instrumental in bridging gaps between town and gown. And I, for one, am so grateful for the DU family and to Sarah Jackson for making it possible. One thing that Sarah always says in any meeting, any signature of her email, her mantra is that families belong together. And with our students, we are one step closer to making this a reality for more and more members of our community.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, you can do better than that. Now listen, I'm an African American, and in our culture is a great ethos of antiphonal engagement. And what that means is call and response. So when I talk, you talk back. So we're going to try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Y'all are quick learners. You should come to one of my classes. So I want to share with you a little bit this evening. Forgive me, I'm going to put up my own personal timekeeper here so I know what I'm doing. I want to talk to you this evening about my work with the Spirituals Project. And some of you may be familiar with it. As a matter of fact, I think I see a couple of Spirituals Projects folk in the house tonight. But the Spirituals Project formerly was a self-standing community organization, and it was founded in 1998 by Arthur C. Jones, who's actually sort of retired, a member of the DU community and faculty here, and is currently serving as the interim Vice Chancellor of Diversity. And he's in the house tonight, and I'm going to point him out in a second. But Art founded the Spirituals Project, and as I recall, not necessarily intending to found the project per se, but after doing a lecture recital at one of the local libraries, discovered that there were many people who were just unfamiliar with the history and the music of the Spirituals. And through various conversations with a mentor and friend of his, Vincent Harding, who used to teach over at ILIF, decided to engage in work that would help to educate the population, the community, and bring this music back to the forefront. And eventually, the Spirituals Project was born. The mission of the project, literally, and we recite this in our rehearsals with the Spirituals Project Choir every week, is to preserve and revitalize the sacred songs called spirituals, which were created and first sung by enslaved Africans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, I'm also aware that many of us may not actually know what this music is. We might have a sense of what this music is, but sometimes I come across folks that have misinterpretations, misunderstandings, misconceptions. So I figured since I'm in an academic situation, I would try to make that abundantly clear as much as I can within the limited amount of time. So what are what I like to call the Negro spirituals? And then you'll say to me, well, Roger, why do you say Negro spirituals? Well, I like to call them the Negro spirituals, and for a period of time, they actually were known by that nomenclature. And that is because the term Negro forces us to acknowledge that this music came into being. It emerged within a specific socio-historic context. So when enslaved Africans were brought here to, at that time, what would have been called the New World, they were brought here against their will. And during that period in history, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, Black people were called Negroes. And so the music that they created, this folk music, in that social context of slavery, was called Negro spirituals. So that's why I like to call the music Negro spirituals, or simply spirituals for short. But I like us to be fully aware of what the historical context of this music is. So let's go back and let me give you just a little more background before I talk a little bit more about the work of the Spirituals Project. So as I teach my students, it is my contention that the music of the spirituals, the Negro spirituals, came about because of the convergence of three essential factors: African culture or African idioms, the socio-historic context of slavery, and because of the enslaved community's engagement and introduction to Christianity. I contend that without all three of these elements, the music of the spirituals would not have emerged. So let me give you just a little more explanation about that. Early scholarship seemed to believe that when enslaved Africans were brought here, they had no culture of their own. That is to say, they were brought here and they were heathens, that they were pagans and unintelligent people. But that is not so. And more recent scholarship gives testament to this. So Africans certainly had their own culture, their own spiritual and religious beliefs. As a matter of fact, Samuel Floyd, a scholar who has written about the history of black music, contends that there are some 3,000 African religions. And so when they came to this new world, they brought their understanding of spirituality with them. Almost all of those religions believed in a high God of some sort, a supreme being, a king or high judge. And so they brought that, but not only that, their understanding of community and the music and how it functioned in community. So in African community, there is a sense that we all exist in a symbiotic relationship. I am because you are. Or in African culture, that word, there's a word that reflects that, and it's called Ubuntu. So in other words, we are all connected, and none of us can exist without the other. So within African culture and music, the music tends to be also very repetitive in terms of lyrical content and its melodic content. And I think that's very intentional because the idea is that everybody will be able to participate. So they brought all of those sensibilities, the thing that I mentioned a little while ago about antiphonal engagement, this call and response. So all of that informed their music making here in the States, the New World at that time. Then we have to talk about their social context. So they were slaves. They were forced into servitude by the colonists here. And so they had no rights. They were treated very inhumanely. Families were broken apart. They were physically abused. They were told that they were not human. As a matter of fact, legally, they were property. And so all of these things informed who they were, and the songs that they sang therefore reflected who they were and how they were being treated, and the lyrical content of their songs spoke about their social condition. Now, where does Christianity come into play? Well, these folks were proselytized by missionaries and even their slave masters. And one of the things I found very fascinating about that, in the early days of slavery and the missionaries trying to convert these so-called pagan folks, it was believed that, or what came up as a point of contention was, what would happen to the slave if you saved their souls? And the thought or the concern among Christians at that time was that if you saved the soul of an African slave, would their body now be free as well? And what it was discovered, or what was decided, was that, well, no. You can go ahead and baptize the enslaved Africans without any kind of repercussions, because it's okay. They will still remain slaves. So they went ahead and started baptizing them and sharing with them Christian beliefs, although some of that was probably a little edited. Some of the favorite scriptures at that time were probably things like slaves obey your masters and things of that nature. So that Christianity was used to enforce docility and cooperation among the enslaved community. So we have, and the enslaved community heard Protestant Christian hymns. So all of this converged, and then we have this music called the Negro Spiritual. Scholar John Lovell points out 7 purposes of the Negro Spiritual. One is to give the community a true, valid, and useful song. So what does that mean? In other words, the community needs a song that they can relate to, something that will encourage them, something that will invigorate them and help them to make it from day to day. If it doesn't do that, then it's not useful. 2, to keep the community invigorated. So in those times when they're feeling very, very low, when things are getting, it feels like things are insurmountable, a song can inspire you to continue and to keep going. to inspire the uninspired individual. Number 3. So in other words, when we get to the point where, I'm just not going to continue anymore. Why do I want to get up tomorrow? A song can help you do that. It can help to enable the group to face its problems. As I've already mentioned, the songs comment on the slave situation. They also stir each member of the community to personal solutions and to a sense of belonging. Again, focusing on the importance of community. And finally, number 7, to provide a code language for emergency use. So in other words, the slaves could sing a song that would have a double meaning, a hidden meaning, if you would, that the slave master would not know. So for instance, one song that's associated with the insurrector Nat Turner was Steal Away. And just so, in case you're not familiar with that song, it's steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus, steal away, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. So quite literally, the song is about going to heaven. But the hidden meaning could mean that you're going to either steal away in the midnight hours to congregate in the invisible church, which was a secret meeting place, or it could mean that the Long Island Road, that's what New York talking. The Underground Railroad could be approaching. So we have all of these things. So I got really passionate about the spirituals. I'm gonna have to move a little quickly, and my phone turned off so I couldn't tell. But anyway, spirituals and gospel music, I just want us to be clear that those are 2 different genres. The spirituals came about, as I mentioned earlier, in the 18th and 19th centuries. But it was the 20th century where gospel music emerged, which was kind of a child of the spirituals. The spirituals emerged in a community of slavery, whereas gospel music emerged during the time of the Great Depression in our country. And so the function of the music was quite different. Spirituals were sung by an enslaved community yearning to be free. Gospel music was encouraging a people who were economically and politically oppressed and depressed, literally. So those are just a few things. Gospel music emerged in urban centers and was accompanied by instruments like the piano, later organ, bass and drums, electric bass and drums. So that is the work of the Spirituals Project. In 2016, the Spirituals Project moved to the University of Denver and is now housed over at the Newman Center and is part of the Lamont School of Music. Our status changed from an independent nonprofit organization to a member of this university. At that time, Arthur Jones and I conceived of a strategic plan that would center around triennial programming to support our mission of education and performance. These 3 events occurring cyclically every 3 years consist of a symposium, a choral festival, and this year we will be mounting a national conference entitled Healing 2020, which will take place in May of this year, May 14th through the 16th to be exact. And the focus of this conference, this national conference, will be healing. Healing we have identified and described as a counterpoint to violence, rupture, and stress, both sustained and sudden. In their earliest iterations, the spirituals responded to physical, spiritual, and cultural violence, and they have continued to do so. Healing, or a lack thereof, is thus a theme that emerges in many ways throughout the spirituals' history and contemporary practice. African families, as I've already mentioned, were separated during the period of slavery. Enslaved Africans were dehumanized, beaten, raped, and mutilated. The spirituals therefore served to sustain the community and became a source of strength, hope, healing, and resistance. The Spirituals Project hosted its first national conference here on the campus of DU in the summer of 2013. We adopted as our theme the principles of REAP, an acronym that stands for Research, Education, Activism, and Performance. This year, we will feature presenters and participants of very diverse professions and perspectives from music, education, literature, history, religion, psychology, culture, social justice, and more. Our keynote speakers include the Reverend Dr. James Alexander Forms Jr., who is the Harry Emerson Fosdick Distinguished Professor at Union Theological Seminary, my alma mater, and Senior Minister Emeritus of the Riverside Church in New York City. Also, we will host Dr. Eileen Gunther, who is a lecturer in organ at the George Washington University and Professor of Church Music at Wesley Theological Seminary. Her second book, In Their Own Words, Slave Life and Power of Spirituals, focuses on the music of the spirituals as understood through slave narratives. It is a very unique book and probably the only one of its kind at this time. And finally, Reverend Dr. James Peters, who served as pastor of New Hope Baptist Church here in Denver for over 28 years before his retirement in 2007. So the Spirituals Project has a choir, which is probably the most visible part of the Spirituals Project. And we affectionately call the choir the ambassadors of the Spirituals Project. So that, in essence, is a portion of the work that I'm doing with the Spirituals Project. Thank you for your time.
And now for something completely different. Thank you, Danny, for inviting me up here to share my passion. Thanks to my fellow presenters, and thank you for everybody for coming tonight. And I teach photography at the University of Denver in the art department, so my perspective is through the art lens. And but as Danny mentioned, I call myself an autobiographical photographer, which is a fancy way of saying I've just been keeping my family album of photographs for the past 50 or 60 years, something like that. So I the way I understand what I'm doing right now is called, the way I understand my life is one thing leads to another, that everything is connected. I'm also an amateur philosopher, so I think I'm using photography to help me understand my relationship to everything else, my relationship with the universe. Not my place in the universe, because that indicates a separateness from it, but my relationship with it, which means I'm part of it. So yeah, photography is the medium that I, for some reason, have decided to use to understand my relationship with everything else. And this is where I'm from. And the question is, where are you guys from? So we have one thing in common. And this is the vessel that I arrived on the planet in. That's my mother. She's pregnant with me. She's pregnant with me in 1953. And she never fished again, apparently. But I'm showing you some of my personal family photo album, just as a context, because in the work we do with communities, I ask other people to share their life stories through their family photographs. So it's a very convenient sort of connection. So that's me in the middle there. That's my brother and my mother. I grew up in the west coast of Scotland, in Argyll. My father worked in the forest. My mother worked in the forest too, actually. And I kind of became aware of the use of photography to record one's life when our families would come and visit us from the city in the summertime. Nobody had any money, so they would come to visit us for the vacations. That's my mother in the middle and two of her sisters. And I kind of had some sort of awareness. People took photographs of the things they wanted to remember, and usually when they were happy, that's when they took their photographs. So I remember thinking, I want to do that. I want to keep a record of my life. So this is my very first photograph of the girl next door, my first girlfriend, Katrina, 1964. And this is the town of Oban, where I'm from. And then I left high school when I was 15. I wasn't doing very well at school. I sort of learning difficulties that nobody seemed to, that hadn't been identified at that point. So I wasn't learning very much. So I thought I'd learn more if I went out the window, as it were, sort of thing, into the world. So this is my first self-portrait. hitchhiking around Ireland in 1969. And then I went to sea for about 2.5 years. And I spent a lot of time in oil tankers going from Europe to the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf. This is Cape Town. That's me in the Arabian Gulf. And I had, always this desire that we have to document where we are and what's happening in our lives, and significant people, significant places. And I have to put this photograph in here. I always question whether I should include this photograph or not, but I have to include it because during my big adventure at sea, this guy who was my boss sexually abused me for about 2 weeks, kind of violently and it was kind of affected my relationship with the universe, I guess. But also gave me another lens for my camera, as it were, sort of thing. Because, and it's also a self-portrait, which is quite significant. But anyway, I'm leaving that in place right now. I completely buried the experience, which I think is classic, when that kind of trauma happens. I buried it until I was in my 40s. Anyway, so I immigrated to Canada in 1972. I got a job with the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a fur trading company, but I'm an animal lover, so I didn't last too long doing that. And it was an Indian reservation I was living in northern Quebec. This is the fur planes coming in at night. And then I switched and I got a job in minerals exploration. I became a minerals prospector and kind of did that off and on for about 25 years. This is my first winter tent experience in Canada. So I spent 10 years living in tents in Canada. Oh, and then I went back to Scotland to do an undergraduate degree in photography, and then I came back to the States to do an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Photography, Boulder, and miraculously, I got a job at the University of Denver teaching photography. Did I mention I was a photography teacher? So, and the first collaborative project that I worked on was through Anne de Prince, Professor Anne de Prince in the psychology department. She introduced me to the Denver Police Department, who were doing a national campaign that was called Start By Believing. It was about victims of sexual violence. The idea was that if someone tells you that something inappropriate has happened to them, that you believe them, you don't ask them what they were wearing or what they were drinking. So Anne knew my story, so she invited me to participate in this project, which was, kind of I used to leave this slide, that was the end of the story sort of thing. So I was able to contribute something to continue the story. So the Denver Police Department supplied about 6 victims of sexual violence, and we photographed them, and it was a bus shelter campaign. And I was actually on one of the bus shelters also, which I was very proud to be on. Anyway, so this is a kind of a significant discovery for me. I discovered this album of photographs on the right here in a flea market in Denver quite a time ago. And the 2 ladies on the left, they had this stall in this antique mall where I bought the album of photographs. And I don't buy other people's photographs typically. This is the only album of photographs that someone else took that I've ever bought. But there was something very beautiful about the photographs. And this is the photographer. Her name is Nina Weist, and that's her with her Kodak Brownie camera, vintage 1917. And there was just something very beautiful about her photographs. And it was a kind of a switch for me because I've been trying to understand the world through my own photographs. So it was this challenge to see if you could do the same thing with someone else's photographs. So, and Nina left a geographical reference, Jim River, in her album, so that took me to North Dakota. And she would present her photographs like this in triptychs. So I went up to North Dakota, that area. This is the area where her family came from Finland in the 1880s, and they homesteaded in this area, actually in South Dakota, just across the border. And this is the Finnish Apostolic Lutheran Church where her family kind of established in South Dakota. So yeah, so I started, on a sabbatical leave from the University of Denver, I spent 4 months in this community as a visiting artist or artist in residence. And so I started, my objective, I gave myself an objective to try and understand why people have a need to create a photographic record of their lives, and what does that mean? And it's a very difficult question to answer, actually. So I started asking people to bring photographs. I would enlarge the photographs and then re-photograph them where the original was taken. And I asked them to give me some, is there a conversation developing between these two photographs? And it became this big community project. And I worked with about 750 school children, K through 12, in 3 different school districts. I asked the children to go home and bring look at all the family photographs, select one, and then bring the photograph, and then they had to write about the photograph, and I would photograph them holding it. That's that little girl's grandmother. That's amazing, it's identical. The kids love this project. So I ended up doing about 750 of them, which is great. So it was the beginning of a kind of a new chapter for me, a developing new chapter, understanding, myself through other people's photographs. And I worked with all kinds of community groups, and the idea was to find out what do photographs mean to us. If my house got fire, she'd run away from the house, and she'd grab the photo album, but she's not really sure why. So the idea is we take photographs, but don't think about why we take photographs. And she said,
I have lots of photographs, but my kids don't want them, so I just shred them. But it makes me cry when I shred them because then the memories are gone.
Because the memories are gone. So photographs is 99% about memory, isn't it? This idea of freezing time, freezing your memories, and sort of mirroring reality in a sense.
When I look in the mirror, I'm always surprised to see an old woman looking back at me. Why do photographs have to be so truthful?
Yeah, so this idea that photographs hold some kind of truth, that they represent reality somehow. And did I mention I'm teaching photography at the University of Denver? So anyway, so I decided to, when I came back from that residency, I decided to include a community aspect to my photography classes. And the idea was to visit retirement communities and ask the residents to bring all their family photographs, and the students would interact with and the students would bring their photographs also. And people would share life stories through the family photographs, because it opens up this very convenient window of engagement. So this lady was the first female vice president of the Whirlpool Corporation, I guess. Anyway, so people bring their family photographs, and it's one of the great. She actually sat in the background. We went there 3 times to this retirement community. She sat off in the background, sort of scowling at us, like she is in her baby photograph. But she could hear all the laughter. So in the 3rd session, she came to engage with us. And anyway, so I met Lotta from the Nobel Institute of Healthy Aging. She put a call out for anybody who was, engaging with the elderly community. So I responded to Lotta's call, the Nobel Institute for Healthy Aging, and that way I was exposed to a lot more community contacts. And also within the Nobel Institute for Healthy Aging, there's an organization called Link Ages that has an office there, and it's a consortium of a lot of community organizations that deal with social isolation and intergenerational dialogue. So, and that's also Carson. She's one of our graduate students who has graduated, who works in the office. And these are 2 of my community partners. The lady on the left, Amy Del Po, on the left. She works for the Denver Public Libraries. And this is Ann Walker. She was my community partner for 2 spring projects with a memory cafe through the Denver Public Libraries. It's a memory cafe. Members have various stages of memory loss. So, and Anne is now a PhD candidate in the communications department. So she's now these are very valuable partners to me now. The partnership started to grow and enrich. And so Amy and Anne came to this is the photo classroom over in the art department. Amy and Anne came in as community partners, and my perspective was as an artist. I just want to hear people's stories, and I want to record the photographs and the stories. But they come in with a much more focused and rigorous sort of programming for us. So they brought a lot of insights into the way, and I learned so much from them. So this is them preparing the students to engage with community members who have Alzheimer's. So this is one of our meetings. In the beginning, we asked people to bring all their photographs, but that became a bit overwhelming. So we asked them to narrow it down to one photograph. And I used the, if your house caught fire, which photograph, if you could only bring one photograph, what would it be? So it kind of made people be a bit more conscious of, what's an important photograph. We set up a little portable studio, and it's amazing. It's like Antiques Roadshow in a sense, isn't it? It's kind of amazing, the variety of photographs. And it was a wonderful experience, to watch, intergenerational dialogue happening. And last spring we did a one-day pop-up exhibition at the Denver Art Museum, and it was such a success that they've invited us back to exhibit again in June at the renovated North Building of the Martin Building, I guess. And there's going to be a community gallery space in there. So we're doing the inaugural exhibition in the community gallery space. So that's us having that's Mimi and Anne, and then the 3 people who have been assigned to the project, to the exhibition project to curate it. And also another wonderful thing that's happening in the art building is we're dedicating a space to be dedicated for community photography projects. As collaborative as possible. I bring my own photo projects into the classroom, and they're almost indistinguishable now, which is really exciting for me. So I continue to do my own project. I've been exhibiting this kind of the work like this with the photograph, the person holding the photograph, and the story with the photograph. This is Rose. She was a Japanese internment camp survivor. Peggy, and this is Dwayne Michaels. Dwayne Michaels, who was an alum, he graduated from DU in 1953. He's probably one of the most significant photographers in the history of photography. So I asked Dwayne, I said, and that's my little boy there. I asked Dwayne, what's the last photograph you'd like to see before you die? Because I knew he'd be okay with that question. Another way to get people to really focus on what's important. And he chose a photograph of his mother, which is really typical of men. The mother. And I've also been photographing war vets for the Nobel Institute for Healthy Aging. I was especially interested in female war vets. And this gentleman here, he's the last vet that I photographed. He was 98, and he told me all these war stories. And I said, what did you do after the war? And he said he became a physicist, and he worked for Honeywell Corporation, and he invented autofocus for cameras. And I had to drag that information out of him. And he died. Sorry, a week later. He was 98. Anyway, so the North Dakota project, I published a little book on that project. And I thought Nina was done with me. She's become a kind of a spirit guide. She leads me around now. I thought I was done with her, but she called me back. And she brought me to northern Finland, to the community where her family came from in the 1880s, I guess. Jokkajärvi is the name of the place. And a lot of reindeer, a lot of art in the fields. And I met this lady here. I only went there for 2 days. And the lady and her daughter, she's a local historian. And I brought her a magazine of where Nina's family homesteaded in South Dakota. And it listed all the Finnish settlers in that area and where they were from in Finland. So I gave her the book, and the next day I went to visit her, and she told me where Nina's family home was, that they had abandoned in the 1880s. So I went to photograph it. And then they came to Escobedo in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and coincidentally, the first place I lived in this country was Escobedo in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. In 1974, I worked for a Canadian mining company there. So. And I made a community partner up there who's a professor at Finlandia University in Houghton, Hancock, up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so this is South Dakota. This is the church that Nina's family sort of built close to their homestead. That's where they're buried. And I have another community partner there now too. The lady on the left, she's a local writer. Anyway, so my next project that I'm launching is I'm going to try and connect 3 communities through family photography. The community Jokkajärvi in northern Finland, and the Upper Peninsula Michigan, and the community in South Dakota. So I'm going to attempt to connect these through. It's a big project, but I'm going to do it. And so So one thing leads to another. That's the first photograph of me in my mother's womb. That's the last photograph of my mother. And this may be what the last photograph of me will look like. You know, like that. You know, one thing leads to another. So it's just great. And that's where I'm from. Thank you.
So inside CAHSS department that, students at TU and me, we study how parents' brain change after they have their own babies. So if you never really thought about that could happen, I can tell you a little bit about that. And it's not all negative. So. All right, so very briefly, so I told you how there are some normative changes that happens in your mother's brain after they have baby. And then we're also really interested in individual differences, and especially because there's a lot of plasticity in the brain during this period of time, people are also sensitive to experience they have. So what if parenting is already quite stressful, but what if someone is experiencing really high levels of stress, how that can actually change the structure and function in the brain in new mothers and further influencing their relationship with children. So that's kind of a little bit of findings that I will share with you. So I start with this topic that I don't think we talk enough about, but I think anybody who have had children, both mothers and fathers, they might have been a bit surprised that the parenting is quite stressful. I remember when I had my first child that, there's a moment that I was crying in the bathroom, and I've been studying parenting for a long time. And then I'm like, nobody told me how hard it was. So this is just an example that, newborns, they need to be fed 8 to 12 times a day, every 2 to 3 hours, 24-hour cycle. So this mom was kind of documenting this 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. And each feeding could take, about an hour or so she gets barely any sleep. So, by this point, you probably wonder, then, why do we have children, right? Because first time, just like me, when I had my first child, I didn't know how hard it was, right? So that explains why we have our first child. But I have 2 sons, so when we have the second child, did we forget everything how hard it was? So as a scientist, just like me and many other people, it's a very interesting question about what we do as human, that even though it's so hard, it requires a huge amount of sacrifice, total upside down changes in your priority. Despite all that we're willing to sign up, once, twice, and 3 times, and then I'll share with you, there are some really fundamental things that's related to our behavior, that's including some really positive aspects, so that we're really happy to sign up for it. That is that the bond that we make with our children is very rewarding. So these are the photographs of my 2 children. They are 2 different children, although they look really similar. But that smile, that eye contact they make with me, the smell, the sweet smell, and that soft feeling that when I cuddle them, all those things bring me the feeling, the kind of this unique joy that I just cannot get from anything else. And that seems to be really key why we do this parenting over generation and generation and generation. In fact, we actually share very similar brain circuitry with all the other mammals, that seeing my baby, hearing my baby activates what we call reward circuitry in the brain. So this same circuitry actually responds to all other things that are rewarding, like food, sex, drug. But when we have children, this brain circuitry is very sensitive to respond to our children. So when I see their smile, when I hear them talking, it strongly activates my brain that I want this. I want to have more of this. And that's why it's so hard to also ignore when they cry, because my brain telling me the signal, go and pay attention, take care of this child. So we have the brain circuitry that helps us to be motivated because it's rewarding. And also, the motivation is only one part of the story. When I hear my child crying, I also need to be able to manage my own emotion. I honestly can feel frustrated. I don't understand why he's crying. Actually, during this period of time, we also have a brain mechanism to support us to have more kind of better emotion regulation, and all supports our parenting behavior. So the non-human animal research was suggesting that early on, with the really elegant studies, that there are some brain changes that happens after we have baby to have these mechanisms. And we weren't at that time sure whether that could happen in human mothers too. And so we studied the mother's brain. We scanned their brain images twice, first month postpartum and again 3 to 4 months postpartum. And we noticed that actually there's quite a lot of structural growth in the brain area during the first few months postpartum period that are related to parenting, like I told you, the reward circuitry and like the prefrontal cortex areas that are important for emotion regulation, because during that period of time, we need those brain areas to manage all the challenges and demands. So those areas that are highlighted in red are the areas that we saw the brain structural growth in new mothers. In the fathers, we also saw some structural changes in fathers too, so don't be too discouraged. Yes. Yes. So it was very exciting for us to notice that the postpartum period may be another period that the brain can be very susceptible to experience that parents can have. So this presents a really interesting idea that the postpartum period may be the window of vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities that, you probably heard about postpartum depression. So during this period of time, these brain changes might be related to why some of the mothers are more vulnerable to depression, but also some positive experience too, like positive support from others. So that, going back to the question that, parenting is already stressful, but imagine being in a situation that, living in a situation that there's a kind of constant chronic stress in my life. How would I be able to living in that situation and also to manage parenting at the same time? We consider those mothers are particularly vulnerable, and those environments can be represented. One of the examples would be poverty. The mothers who are experiencing poverty tend to be, on average, experience really high levels of stress. And I think there is some perception that people think maybe the poor mothers may be poor mothers, but we thought that it would be important to show that what aspects of the poverty that can actually influence the mother's adaptation to parenthood, that might be related to some increased challenges to have the bond with their children or respond to them sensitively, and that way we were hoping to be able to contribute to kind of clarify some of those kind of labels that can be associated with those mothers and find some better ways to support them. So though, going back to the non-human animal literature, that there's really nice causal mechanisms, those studies showing that the prenatal or postnatal stress can actually change the maternal brain, which can in turn, unfortunately, related to more kind of harsh parenting. Because it's, kind of throwing the question at the mom that, the environment is really unstable and harsh, whether mom should really focusing on surviving for herself or taking care of the children. So that's kind of the idea behind why our brain might adapt in that way. For humans, of course, the answer is a lot more complicated, but to get that, we use fMRI machine that helps us to understand the activation of the mother brain when she's listening to her baby crying or other baby crying. So I can kind of play you just a sample of cry the mother listens. So that was just 5 seconds. We'll play them 20 seconds and many times, and it's very effective to capture the brain activation that are involved in parenting. Because you probably had an urge to like jump out and then go to that baby, right? That's exactly what we want. Oh, that wasn't intentional. Unfortunately, what we found was then that lower income was associated with reduced prefrontal cortex activation when she was listening to baby cry. So usually in this area, which is important for emotion regulation, we expect increased activation when she listened to baby cry. But unfortunately, like here, the lower income was associated with the lower activation. And like I mentioned, it was very important for me to find some explanation what aspect of poverty that can be related to this association. And we found that it's more stress. So the mothers, especially who are experiencing the multiple of distressors that we asked the mother, but living in crowded and noisy house, experiencing neighborhood violence, have a marital dissatisfaction, and food insecurity. So the when mothers experiencing more numbers of distressors, which we call cumulative risk, that was indeed related to that dampened brain response to her baby. What really made us concerned was that that lower brain activation in the brain region was related to lower sensitivity that we observed when she was interacting with her baby. Lower maternal sensitivity and the lower brain activation. To me, I think that it's really important to focus on the stress, really high levels of the stress the mothers can experience during postpartum period. And this really kind of presents that challenges to the mothers, how her brain may be, appropriately adjust and adapt to the motherhood. Therefore, to help her to form really deep emotional bonds with her children and respond to her children sensitively in those cases. Especially the brain regions in the emotion regulation. So what I also want to say is that, this findings may be helpful for us to understand that poverty and related stress is a important target for us to think about how to engage with the mothers during the postpartum period to support their positive transition to motherhood. But the fact that there is a gradient associations, meaning that there's this kind of linear association between income and the brain activation, that means that anybody actually at that income age can be affected. It's not just limited to the low income mothers who are affected for their brain activation for baby and parenting, but it can be anybody on that scale. So perhaps maybe I end the presentation kind of sharing some of the ways to kind of interpret these findings is that we care a lot about children and supporting their brain development and their growth, but especially during this early period of time when the new family is formed, it's probably important to pay attention to the mother's well-being, so that that helps for whole family to have the safe and stable environment, and the mother can be more empowered to provide the sensitive care and the long-term positive bond with her children. So I want to thank all my wonderful students, helped me with the research, and then University of Denver too. Thank you.
Hi, this is just a comment. Roddy, Ann Walker sings in the Spirituals Project.
No!
Yes, you want to take some pictures.
That proves that again, doesn't it? One thing is all connected. What was that word? What was the word?
I just wanted to know if you have any performance dates for the choir.
Oh, several. If you go to the Lamont School of Music website and you look under the tab that says Special Programs, and you click on that, the Spirituals Project will come up on many of the options on the page. Click on the Spirituals Project, and at the bottom of that, you'll see our performance schedule. The next one we have is actually our first full concert of the season here on campus at the Newman Center in Gates Hall, Thursday, February 27th at 7:30. It is a free concert, and parking is complimentary. Bring one, bring them all.
Elizabeth, I'm kind of interested in whether Helen Thorpe's initial investigations into South High students and her work with immigrants became a groundwork for your work.
Very good question. I actually started working on the immigration history course and working with Casa De Paz prior to Helen Thorpe's book about South High. However, her book prior to that, well, probably 2 or 3 prior, she's very prolific. Just Like Us, if any of you are familiar with that work, it actually took place here at the University of Denver, where she followed the stories of 4 Mexican young women from the Denver community, 2 of whom were undocumented and 2 of whom were born in the United States and or had a regularized U.S. status. And she really follows the ways in which those who had U.S. citizenship had so many doors open to them, especially when it came to going to college and or receiving financial aid. And because these young women had had so many of the same experiences in high school, up until that point, it became this real telling moment just how many doors close when you are undocumented, especially if you are trying to further yourself in terms of higher education. So that book did influence sort of my thinking about what it means to be undocumented, especially when you are trying to succeed, right, in a college campus or get a job after your college career comes to an end, if you are so lucky to actually find financial sponsorship.
DU figures prominently in that book.
It does, and so I have assigned that in several classes. Thank you for your question.
I have 2 questions. The first for Professor Kim. Have you had the opportunity to re-image some of these mothers at 5 or 10 years down the road to see if these brain changes are permanent? Are they transient? Have they influenced changes in the brain elsewhere?
Excellent question. Yes. Unfortunately, I have not, but I would love to. But there are people who study the brains of the parents with older children, and it seems like very similar brain areas respond to older children too. So I would imagine that as long as people, have their children, these changes might maintain. And then, in fact, there are been studied with grandparents too. So when people do very similar study with grandparents showing images of their grandchildren, also very similar brain areas about parental love being activated. So yes, great question.
Second question for Professor Escobedo. Have your experiences at the CAHSS led you to an attempt to influence public policy, particularly as it relates to immigration?
I think I would answer that so my entrance into having any sort of influence on public policy would strictly be in the classroom at this point. So in other words, getting students that previously might not have any knowledge that a detention center is basically in our backyard, right, in the city of Aurora, to understand that place exists, that it is a for-profit institution, and that the circumstances within those walls are pretty grim. And Sarah and I have had many conversations about the fact that she relies totally and completely on donations. She also started a volleyball league, and individuals who are involved with Volleyball Internacional, all of their dues go to supporting the CAHSS. But in her mind, what is most impactful is for someone to step in that door and to talk to a migrant about their experiences. She'd much rather have that happen than getting a donation in the mail, which I think is just remarkable. Obviously the money is good, but in her mind, if you are exposing students to life histories and stories that they simply never would have had experience with, that's where new conversations around policy can begin.
If you could pass the mic this way, I'll try and fix it.
Can you hear me?
Dr. Kim, I can speak loudly. Fatherhood and the transfer of this information to fathers for whom birthing is a different world, and the relationship to wife and baby, and many of the frustrations that young fathers have, and knowing what's going on with my wife, and being left out, so to speak, during these critical periods of time. Do you know of any innovative efforts being made to help fathers better understand what you are researching so we can be better parents?
Yeah, excellent question. Yes, yes. There is increasing interest in understanding the fatherhood. As you know, more and more the fathers are involved in parenting. But you actually told some of the challenges the fathers have during this period of time really well. We, in the literature we say it's kind of guarding. So sometimes mothers actually kind of guarding the baby. That even though the father really wants to be involved, the mother wouldn't really acknowledge the father's ability to do so. So that can be just one of the examples. Or we go to home and we interview fathers, and they would often say, "Oh, you're the first people who ask me this kind of questions." How do you find parenting? Do you think it's positive? Is it negative? Right? I think it seems to be in the literature that that keeping the connection between the father and the child, and all together as a whole family, is a key for fathers to feel really rewarded in parenting. So one of the studies that I did, that I found that actually the aspects of the parenting that really best predicts their sensitive parenting behaviors with children, for mothers having a little less worry about the parenting itself seems to be really important, because the mothers tend to really worry about everything during this period of time. But for fathers, what's really important is them to feel very positive about being a parent. So that positive perception of the parenting. And that really hit me at that time, that how when I had my first child, that when I was worrying about all the things, how much my baby's eating and how much my baby's sleeping, my husband would then like come with my baby perfectly swaddled, like, look at perfectly swaddled the baby. Like, would you not like compliment me, you know? And I'll be like, how is this the most important thing right now? Right? But that was very important for him at that moment to feel like I'm a father and I'm doing a good job. So yeah, thanks so much for that question, and that's a really important aspect of this research. Yes.
I don't need the microphone. Dr. Kim, have you done any research with parents who are not the biological parents of the child?
Yeah, so I didn't do the work, but there is a research study with people who are involved in the foster care. So when they study the people who do foster care, and then they presented images of the children in the foster care, the similar brain regions also respond to them, and also they also see the oxytocin, the love hormone levels increase when they see the foster children. So it seems to be what's the key is that whether the adults have that emotional bond with the child that we call attachment.
Is the same true with single-sex couples?
Oh yeah, that's a great question too. Yeah, so there is also a study, I didn't do it, but there is also a study about the gay couples, and very similarly that we see the brain activation in the, we call brain areas for parental love being activated in gay fathers as well. And it seems like to be also the case that the more time that, because there's always two people, and then, one of the people tend to spend more time with the baby. So the more time they spend with the baby seem to be also related to more strong brain activation to the particular child that they're cared for. So, there is a gender, but it seems like it's just really that the depth of that emotional bond they can make and the time they can spend with the children seems to be related to the brain response. Yes. Mm-hmm.
One more question.
My question is also for Dr. Kim. I was wondering what other factors other than poverty account for the mother's brain not responding to the way.
Yeah, so it's related to poverty too in some cases, but thanks for the question. The other things that people have observed are trauma. So that could be the childhood trauma. Myself, unfortunately, didn't have a chance to have caring mother. And it seemed to be actually make quite fundamental changes in my childhood, in my brain, which unfortunately related to some more difficulties to respond to my child at the brain level as well. Another one that people observed is the postpartum depression. So the mothers who are experiencing postpartum depression have higher levels of challenge to sensitively respond to their children in their brain, also in everyday life. So yes. Mm-hmm.
May I just make a comment?
Really quick, yeah.
I wanted to make a comment to your presentation that how important it is. You've given us your whole life story in 15 minutes. I mean, basically, I want to hear more, but it was quite an enlightening in how important photography is to record history.
Right, and well, thank you for saying that. And we all have a life story. Everybody has I always tell the students, everybody's a gold mine when it comes to stories.
May I thank Roger for singing?
Yes.
Okay, in fact, thank you to all of you for diverse, amazing passing. We want to hear more about all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. This is wonderful, wonderful. Have the community, members of the DU and the Denver community. And before you go, if you enjoyed this, which I know you all did because you're still here, please join us for our next event, February 12th, on the ethical stewardship of contemporary Native art. And there's details in your programs. That's on February 12th. There will be more faculty and experts talking about this important area that we're looking into. And I'd love to have you here for that. Please look in your programs. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.